Welcome to Metamorphose, the podcast that awakens awareness. I am anneghesquiere, author and editor of projects committed to a new world. Every week, we go together to discover a bright subject with a guest that carries a voice of awareness. Thank you for being with us today.
Metamorphose. Awaken your consciousness.
Do you feel like you are losing your attention span, that it's becoming increasingly difficult to concentrate or achieve a state of full presence? Do you then fall into the trap of guilt, blaming yourself for spending too much time on social media or switching tasks every 5 minutes? Stop. My guest today sheds light on the systemic causes of the attention crisis with a powerful message. This phenomenon is bigger than us. After watching his godson disappear behind screens, this British journalist embarked on a worldwide investigation to understand why we can no longer stay focused. In his book, Stolen Focus, an international bestseller now translated into French and published by Éditions Eyrolles, he identifies 12 root causes that are stealing our attention, based on more than 250 expert interviews and a 3-month digital detox experiment. His message is clear: we can regain control, but only by acting collectively. Hello, Johann Hari.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks very much.
How is it to be in France?
J'ai honte de parler en anglais dans cette interview, mais quand j'étais enfant, j'ai parlé bien français, mais j'ai oublié tous mes mots. Je sais lire, mais pour parler, c'est trop difficile pour moi. So I apologize to everyone listening. It's shameful that my French is not good enough, but I'm very happy to be in Paris. I love Paris, so I come here quite a lot. So I'm very happy. I came here during the research for the book, so I'm always looking for excuses to come to Paris.
Oh, so who did you meet in Paris for the research of your book?
I was looking at the right to disconnect, which I guess we'll come to later. But yeah, it was. But to be honest, I just wanted an excuse to come here.
Okay, so you've previously written major books about depression and loneliness. What drove you to investigate attention this time and write this book that I had the chance to publish here?
I guess I could feel my own attention was getting worse and worse. With every year that passed, things that require deep focus that are so important to me, like reading books, having proper long conversations, even watching films, were just getting harder and harder. I could still do them, of course, but with every year that passed, it was more and more like running up a down escalator. Do you know what I mean? And I could see this was happening to so many people around me. You know, we're living in a huge crisis of attention. The average office worker now focuses on any one task for less than a minute. And for every one child who's been identified with serious attention problems when I was 7 years old, there's now 100 children who've been identified with that problem. But to be honest, I didn't really want to write about it. I was quite ashamed. I thought there was something wrong with me. I was pretty sure I knew why it was happening. I thought, well, someone invented the smartphone, that screwed me over. And, you know, I thought I was lacking in willpower, right? I'm just not strong enough to resist these temptations. But there was a moment when I realized I really had to dig into this deeper. So, like you mentioned in your intro, I've got a godson, and I've got several, but talk about one in particular. So when he was 9, he developed this brief and unbelievably cute obsession with Elvis Presley. And the reason it was so cute is because he seemed to genuinely not know that impersonating Elvis had become a kind of cheesy cliche. So I think he was the last person in the history of the world to do a totally sincere version of Jailhouse Rock. It was adorable. And every night when I would tuck him into bed, he got me to tell him the story of Elvis's life over and over again. I skipped over the bit at the end where he shit himself to death on the toilet, obviously. But And one night I mentioned Graceland, where Elvis lived. I said that people go and visit it. And his whole face lit up and he said, Johann, will you take me to Graceland one day? And I said, sure, the way you do with 9-year-olds, because like next week he'll want to go to the North Pole or whatever. And he said to me, no, do you really swear one day you'll take me to Graceland? And I said, I absolutely promise. And I didn't think of that moment again for 10 years until so many things had gone wrong. So by the time he was 19, this will sound like an exaggeration, it's not. He spent literally almost all his waking hours alternating between his iPad, his iPhone, and his laptop. And his life was just this blur of Snapchat, YouTube, porn. And it really felt like he was almost spinning at the speed of Snapchat, where nothing kind of still or serious could get to him. You know, he's a very intelligent person. You would really like him. But it was like nothing could get any traction in his mind, you know. And one day we were sitting in my apartment in London, and all day I was trying to get a conversation going with him, and I just couldn't. And to be totally honest with you, I wasn't that much better. I was staring at my own devices. And we were sitting there, and I suddenly remembered this moment all these years before, and I said to him, hey, this is no way to live. Let's go to Graceland. And he looked at me completely blankly. He didn't even remember this thing from years ago. And I reminded him, and I said, look, we can't live like this. Let's go on a big road trip all over the American South. But you've got to promise me one thing, which is that if we go, you'll leave your phone in the hotel during the day, because there's no point going if you're just going to look at Snapchat the whole time. And he really thought about it, because he wasn't happy living like this. And he said, you know what, I want to do this. So I think it was literally 2 weeks to the day later, we took off from London to New Orleans, where we went first. And a couple of weeks later, we got to the gates of Graceland. And this is even before COVID. It turns out when you get to Graceland now, there's no human being to show you around. You arrive, they hand you an iPad, and the iPad shows you around. So you put in earbuds, and the iPad says, you know, go left, go right. And every room you go in, it tells you a story about that room, and there's an image of that room on the iPad in front of you. So it has this really weird effect that everyone just walks around Graceland staring at the iPad, right?
And not watching Graceland.
Not looking at it. And I'm kind of walking around, I'm getting a bit kind of tense, a bit pissed off. I'm like, you know, look at the place. You all travelled a long way to get here. And we got to the jungle room, which was Elvis's favourite room in Graceland. It's called that because it's got loads of fake plants in it. They've kept it exactly as it was when he died. And I'll never forget them. There was a middle-aged Canadian couple next to us, and they were just staring at the iPad, and the man turned to his wife and said, honey, this is amazing. Look, if you swipe left, you can see the jungle room to the left, and if you swipe right, you can see the jungle room to the right. And I turned to look to them, and they were just swiping back and forward, and I leaned forward and I said, but hey, sir, there's an old-fashioned form of swiping you could do. It's called turning your head, because you realise you don't need to look at the jungle room on the internet. It's literally all around us, right? And they looked at me like I was crazy and backed out the room. And I turned to my godson to laugh about it. And he was standing in the corner staring at Snapchat, because from the moment we landed, he could not stop. He literally couldn't stop. And I went up to him, and I tried to grab the phone out of his hands. Never a good idea with teenagers. And I said to him, look, I know you're afraid of missing out, but this is guaranteeing that you'll miss out. You're not showing up at your own life. You're not present at the events of your own existence. This is no way to live. And he stormed off, understandably. And I walked around Memphis on my own that day. And I found him that night in the Heartbreak Hotel where we were staying up the street. And he was sitting by, there's a huge guitar-shaped swimming pool. And he was sitting there, and I went up to, he was looking at his phone, and I went up to him, and I apologised for getting so angry. And he didn't look up from his phone, but he said, I know something's really wrong, and I don't know what it is. And I realised in that moment, we came away to get away from this problem of distraction, but there was nowhere to escape to. It's everywhere. It's the air we all breathe. And I realised in that moment, okay, I need to look into this. There's something deeper going on here than a flaw in me and a flaw in him. And that's why I ended up going on this big journey all over the world, from Miami to Melbourne to Moscow to here in France, to interview over 250 of the leading experts on attention and focus, and really figure out what's happening to us and how we get our attention back.
But that's one of the most interesting things with teenagers. They spend so much time on social media, but when you interview them, they tell you that they wish it did not exist. They wish TikTok was not there. They are they know deeply that it's not good for them, but they cannot help using it.
Yeah, they have a profound sense. Sometimes this is framed as if people who are warning about the effects of attention are sort of standing above teenagers going, oh, young people today, right? There's something wrong with them. It's the opposite of the truth. Young people know this better than anyone, partly because they've been affected even more badly than older people. And there's nothing wrong with teenagers. There's something wrong with the environment, right? The book is called Stolen Focus in English because your attention did not collapse. Your attention has been stolen from you. And interestingly, when I studied this in great detail over 3 years and did a really deep dive into the scientific research around this, what I learned is there's actually scientific evidence for 12 factors that can make your attention better or can make your attention worse. And loads of the factors that can make your attention worse have been hugely rising in recent years. This is why we're in this crisis. And these factors actually range quite widely from the food we eat to the way our offices are designed, to the way our kids' schools are designed, to air pollution, of course, some of the elements of technology, not all of our technology, that I'm sure we'll get to. So actually, this is a very broad range of forces that are profoundly undermining our attention. But crucially, once we understand what those factors are, we can get out of the dynamic of blaming ourselves, blaming our kids, and actually start getting angry with the forces that are doing this to us, and crucially begin to deal with those forces. And I never forget someone who massively guided a lot of the insights for the book, an amazing person called Dr. James Williams, who had been at the heart of Silicon Valley, was disgusted and left and became, I would argue, the most important philosopher of attention in the world right now. He's now at Oxford. Said to me, the axe existed for 1.2 million years. Human beings had axes for 1.2 million years before anyone said, guys, shall we put a handle on this axe, right? The entire internet has existed for less than 10,000 days. Loads of these factors that are harming our attention are very recent. Many of them didn't exist when I was a child, right? We can fix these factors if we want to. Sometimes it's framed as, the factors that are undermining our attention are just an inevitable part of the modern world. This is just the way the world works. Now, I'm here to tell you that is absolutely not true, right? These are recent forces in many cases, not every case. These are recent forces, and we can put them right to some degree as individuals and to some degree as a society.
So before we go into those forces, what is attention? How can we define it?
Attention is your ability to narrow down to one specific act or way of thinking. So you think about the room we're in now, right? So we're sitting in a recording studio, but if I turn my head to the left, I can see your nice technician who has a very good beard that I'm jealous of. I was saying to him earlier, because I tried to grow a beard. It did not look stylish and elegant like his. If I turn my head a little bit, I can see Sabine, who's my brilliant French publicist. I could look around the room. I can see this light here. If I listen very carefully, I can just about hear the buzzing of this light. I could look at your shoes. I could think about them. But I'm narrowing my focus down from all of those things onto you. What did you just ask me? You asked me to define attention. So attention is your ability to selectively attend to phenomena in your environment, right? So we can all feel how that's being interfered with, right? Like, I turned my phone off when we started this conversation because, if my phone was buzzing in my pocket now, I would be pulled away from your question. So this has been constantly, our ability to selectively attend to phenomena in our environment is being constantly interrupted. To give you an obvious example, a guy called Professor Michael Posner at the University of Oregon did a really shocking piece of research. He found that if you're interrupted by something as simple as a text message, it takes you, on average, 23 minutes to get back to the level of focus you had before you were interrupted. So there'll be people listening to this podcast, right, who, while they listen to it or watch it on YouTube, they'll get a text message and they'll think, I'll look at the text, I'll reply very quickly. What does that take? 10 seconds? Nothing, right? Then I'll come back to the podcast. You think it takes you 10 seconds. It takes you 10 seconds plus the 23 minutes it takes you to fully refocus your mind on the topic. But most of us never get 23 minutes without being interrupted. So we're constantly operating at this lower level of cognitive ability. We're constantly interrupted in our ability to selectively attend to phenomena in the environment.
Do we all have naturally the same level of attention, or are some people more sensitive to disruptions?
So the best way to understand this is, it sounds technical and fancy, it's actually very simple. It's something called the biopsychosocial model. So with something like attention, or actually with lots of things in our lives, depression, obesity, all sorts of things, there are three kinds of cause. There's biological causes, like your genes, changes in your brain. There's psychological causes like stress, loneliness. And there's social causes like, the society you live in, right? Financial insecurity would be an example of a social cause. And they're all real and they all play out to some degree. So if you're listening and you've got attention problems, to some degree, these three factors will play out for you. And they'll be different for different people. The way I think of it is if you've got to picture a bathtub with 3 taps, right? Some people will have a very strong biological tap. Maybe they're naturally, biologically less, on a spectrum where they're less inclined to deep attention and focus. Some people will have lots of psychological factors. Maybe they've just come back from being a soldier in a war zone. Then that would be an extreme example. And some people will have high social factors. It will vary. But all these, if you picture them as taps, all that goes down into the bathtub, it swirls together, and that water is you, right? So these factors will vary for different people, but they play out for everyone to some degree.
Your book also revealed that attention is at the heart of everything we do. I love the quote of Dr. James Williams saying, "To be able to do what matters in any field, you must be able to pay attention to important things." That's also why we should protect our ability to focus, right?
Yeah, he's such a wise person. I would say to anyone listening, think about anything you've ever achieved in your life that you're proud of, whether it's starting a business, being a good parent, learning to play the guitar, whatever it is. That thing that you're proud of required a huge amount of sustained focus and attention. And the evidence is very clear. When your ability to focus and pay attention deteriorates, your ability to achieve your goals deteriorates. Your ability to solve your problems deteriorates. You feel worse about yourself because you actually are less competent when you can't pay attention. Attention is our superpower as a species. It is at the heart of all achievement, musical achievement, sporting achievement, being a good friend, right? They all require attention. And if attention is our superpower as a species, the way I began to think about it is, at the moment we're surrounded by kryptonite, right? And our job is to get that kryptonite out of the environment. And when you regain your attention, it really is a sensation of regaining your superpower, right? It's a sensation of regaining your deepest capacities as a human being.
What about mind wandering? Because in the book, you also shed light on this lesser known aspect of attention.
There's so many things I learned when I was writing the book that really surprised me, and this is one of them. So at the start of working on the book, I thought I was still in a very individualistic way of thinking about it. And I thought, there's something wrong with me. My willpower isn't strong enough. Okay, what I need, and the technology, the smartphone is there, and that's undermining me. So the solution is obvious. I should use my willpower to separate myself from the smartphone, right? And I was in this very lucky position. An Oscar-nominated movie got made out of one of my books. The film is called The United States versus Billie Holiday. In French, the book is called Le Primat des Stupes. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to use the money to go away from my phone and my laptop. So I went for 3 months to a place called Provincetown in the United States in Cape Cod. And I went there and I had no phone and no laptop that could get on the internet for an entire 3 months, right?
The real digital detox.
Yeah, like a hardcore, I basically joined the Amish, right? Although it's a very gay town, so not quite like the Amish. But, and there were many ups and downs in those 3 months. But the thing that most shocked me was how much my attention came back. Like, I was stunned. I could read books for 8 hours a day, right? And that's not just because of the technological detox. Actually, there were all sorts of things that changed that we can talk about that are related to these 12 factors that I write about in the book. But the thing that really surprised me, one of the things that really surprised me, is I went there to get my focus back, right? To kind of do deep focus, like read books. But quite quickly, I started going out, and I would go for long walks. And I obviously didn't have my phone, so I had to just walk with nothing, right? Normally, when I walk around, I'm listening to audiobooks, I'm listening to podcasts, I'm talking to my friends, and I couldn't do that. And I would go for these really long walks, and at first I thought, this is not what I came here to do, right? I came here to focus, not to just, let my mind wander. But actually, I quite quickly realised it was in those hours when I was walking that I was starting to have my best ideas. I was starting to be most creative. And there's a whole science of looking at this. So mind wandering is when you let your thoughts float without any obvious thing to think about, right? Any obvious anchor. So if you're reading a book, you're not mostly mind wandering, you're mostly thinking about the subject of the book. People listening to this podcast are mostly not mind wandering, they're thinking about what we're saying, right? But mind wandering is when you just set that aside and you just let yourself go off. And there's been I later learned, there's been, and I interviewed the experts on this and did a deep dive into the research, there's been a huge renaissance, or really naissance, in the last 20 years in the study of mind wandering, partly because of all the developments in fMRI technology. And it turns out, so we think of mind wandering as a waste of time, right? If anyone listening has kids and you go to your parents' evening and the teacher says, "Oh, little Johnny, he just lets his mind wander all the time," that will not be a compliment. But it turns out mind wandering is really important for thinking. When you let your mind wander, it turns out that's when you process the past and make sense of it. It's when you anticipate the future and prepare yourself for it. And it's when you combine ideas in your mind that otherwise would not be combined, which is actually where creativity comes from. So it's really important. But we have driven mind wandering out of our lives, right? Like walking around Paris yesterday when I first arrived, got here, I walked out of Gare du Nord, I went for a walk for a couple of hours, and it's very rare you see a person walking around Paris who's just not got headphones, walking around, listening to people around. It's actually quite dangerous to walk around Paris now because people just walk straight into you because they're so busy looking at their phones. Yeah. So we've driven and when I got mind wandering back into my life, I realised what a gift it was. It's one of the really big changes I've made since then. That was in 2018 that I went to Provincetown. Now, wherever I am in the world, I have at least an hour a day where I leave my phone at home and I go for a walk. And I have a notebook in case I have good ideas, I don't want to forget them, but I don't take anything else with me. And that is almost always the most creatively fertile hour of my day.
Yeah. And one last lesser known aspect of attention is the connection between attention and presence in the world. You mentioned the case of this man standing still, facing the ocean, the complete opposite of Facebook, you write. Is attention the key to accessing a contemplative dimension of existence?
This was so weird. I remember the day that happened. So Provincetown is at the tip of Cape Cod. So it's like a sandbar that goes into the ocean, basically, a huge long sandbar. And I remember very early in being in Provincetown, I went for a walk. And I kind of stopped in my tracks because there was this guy who looked like he was standing in the middle of the ocean quite far out. And I was like, oh my God, what's happening? But actually what happens is there's sort of these long bars of sand that are just under the ocean. So you can walk on them. And he was just staring out to sea for like hours and hours. And I look at him and I had been, I had been so busy for so long. I hadn't really stopped really for years. Mm-hmm. And I remember looking at this guy and thinking, God, I could never do that. And yet he looked so happy and so peaceful. And I remember, like you say, thinking, God, this is like the opposite. I mean, Facebook now actually seems quite slow-paced compared to what's happened since. But I remember, Facebook looks like a Henry James novel next to TikTok. But I remember just really being kind of knocked back by that. And it's interesting, if we think about attention, when you start to look at attention, it seems like quite a small subject. It's like a minor irritant, right? It's like, oh, I'm distracted a fair bit. You know, I went to the fridge to get a Coke Zero to drink, but I got a text message from my friend. I was standing in the kitchen. I couldn't remember why I was there. I went back. I didn't have the Coke Zero. We think of things like that, like minor irritations. But actually, what I was fascinated by, when you look at the science of attention, the more you look at it, the more you realize it affects every single layer of our existences. So there's this typology of attention that I think is really worth thinking about. So the obvious form of attention we think about is the one we've already talked about, which is Dr. Williams calls our spotlight.
Yeah.
So, like I was saying, you know, your spotlight is your ability, picture a spotlight on a stage on an actor, right? You go and see Lady Gaga and there's a spotlight on her, right? So that's the narrowing down. So the lowest level of attention is your ability to narrow down your attention to perform an immediate action, like going to the fridge to get a Coke Zero or whatever. And we can all feel how that's being interrupted all the time. The next level up is what he calls your starlight, which is not your ability to achieve an immediate task like going to the fridge. It's your ability to achieve a long-term task like, you know, setting up a business, writing a book, whatever. He calls it your starlight because if you're lost in the desert without GPS and you don't know where you're going, you look to the stars and you're like, oh yeah, that's where I'm headed, right? That is obviously being profoundly interrupted in this environment we're living in. The next layer up is what he calls your daylight, which is not your ability to achieve a long-term goal. It's your ability to even know what your long-term goals are. How do you know what business you want to set up? How do you know what it means to be a good parent? How do you know what book you want to write? To get those insights, you have to have moments of rest, of deep thought, of focus, of mind wandering, all sorts of things, of flow, which we could talk about. And in this environment, that's being really disrupted. The way he puts it is we're kind of decohering. And I would argue, and I know he agrees with this, there's actually a fourth layer to this, to attention, which I would call our stadium lights, which is not just your ability to formulate and achieve long-term goals for yourself, but our ability as a society to formulate and achieve collective goals, right? Which is being profoundly disrupted in this environment we live in. We're just speaking, you know, not so long, a couple of weeks after the, from my view, catastrophic re-election of Donald Trump. All over the world, our ability to formulate and achieve collective goals is breaking down. We're turning to these very extreme solutions. Why am I sitting here not as a European citizen? Because my country went fucking crazy about this. And these dynamics that are destroying our individual attention are also destroying our collective attention and undermining democracy all over the world. When countries as different as Britain, Brazil and Burma are all going crazy in similar ways, polarizing and becoming extreme and breaking down these collective goals, that tells you there's an underlying dynamic, which is, of course, there are many factors, but partially related to this attention crisis. So yeah, I think the attention seems like a small thing, but when you look at it, it's actually determinative of everything in your life. There'll be lots of people listening who have kids in their life, like I do, who can see that their kids are really struggling to focus. And you can see very clearly that is going to mark their whole lives if we don't fix this. Right? A person who can't focus is just going to be permanently less than they could have been. And a person who regains their focus can be more than they would have been.
And we understand that by reading about all the experts that you interviewed, over 250 experts worldwide. How did you choose those experts? The panel is very broad. We have human behavior specialists, economists, teachers. How did you pick them?
So I was trained in the social sciences at Cambridge University. So I started by just doing a really wide reading on loads of different scientific papers. And then I started interviewing people, and there's, I know nothing about nature, so I don't know if this analogy is actually correct, but I learned about this from a brilliant writer called Anne Lamott. In Thoreau, in his book about Walden Pond, there's an analogy he uses from nature, or something he says about nature, which I used as an analogy, she uses and I use as an analogy. So apparently, if you want to find a beehive and you don't know where it is, if you just stay in one place with a jar and you catch a bee and keep it there for a minute, it will always fly in the direction of the hive. So you chase it, you'll lose it, wait there, catch another bee, let that one go. And if you do that like 50 times, eventually you find the beehive, right? And for me, it was similar. So I would go and interview an expert and I would say, who else should I talk to? And they would name like 10 people. I would go and talk to them. Every one of them, I'd say, who else should I talk to? And so gradually, if you chase the bee, gradually you begin to find the answers. But I think for this, because attention is a very complex subject with many factors that both boost it and harm it, like you said, I had to look very widely from economics to psychology to nutrition. So it was really fascinating. Just like attention affects everything, attention is affected by so many different factors that it was just a joy to research because it's so interesting. And when you begin to look at it, you begin to see so quickly how many of these things play out in your own life.
Yeah. So in our environment, closest environment, what is harming our attention?
Like I say, there's 12 factors. Let's start with maybe one that I think will be playing out for literally everyone listening or watching today to some degree. I went to MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, to interview one of the leading neuroscientists in the world, an amazing man named Professor Earl Miller. And he said to me, look, there's one thing you need to understand about the human brain more than anything else. You can only consciously think about one or two things at a time. That's it. This is a fundamental limitation of the human brain. The human brain is not going to change significantly. You know, this has been the case. The last time the human brain significantly changed was 40,000 years ago. But what's happened is we've fallen for a kind of mass delusion. The average teenager now believes they can follow 6 or 7 forms of media at the same time, and most older people are not that far behind them. So what happens is scientists like Professor Miller, scientists all over the world, including here in France, get people into labs, younger people, older people, and they get them to think they're doing more than one thing at a time, and they monitor them. And what they discover is always the same. You can't do more than one thing at a time. What you do is you juggle very rapidly between tasks. You're like, what did you just ask me? What is this message on WhatsApp? What does it say on the TV there about what Trump just did? What is this message on Facebook? Wait, what did you just ask me again? So we're constantly juggling. And it turns out that juggling comes with a really big cost. The technical term for this, it's a term everyone should know, is the switch cost effect. When you switch between tasks, that comes with a cost. You make more mistakes. You remember less of what you do. You're significantly less creative. And I remember when I first learned about that, thinking, okay, I get it. That's obviously true. But this is like a small effect, right? It's like a niggling effect. This is a really big effect. I'll give you an example of a very small study that's backed by a wider body of evidence. Hewlett-Packard, the printer company, got a scientist in to study their workers. And he split them into 2 groups. And the first group was told, get on with your task, whatever it is. You're not going to be interrupted. Just do what you've got to do, right? And the second group was told, get on with your task, do what you've got to do. But at the same time, you've got to answer loads of emails and phone calls. So, like, that's how most of us live. At the end of the experiment, Dr. Glenn Wilson, the scientist involved, tested the IQ of both groups. And he discovered that the group that had not been interrupted scored, on average, 10 IQ points higher than the group that had been interrupted. To give you a sense of how big an effect that is, if you and me sat down now and we got out some cannabis and we smoked a fat spliff and we got stoned, our IQs would go down in the short term by 5 points. So being chronically interrupted in the way we are all the time is twice as bad for your intelligence in the short term as getting stoned. You'd be better off sitting at your desk, smoking a spliff and doing one thing at a time than you would sitting at your desk, not smoking a spliff and being constantly interrupted. Now, I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea. You'd be better off neither smoking a spliff nor being interrupted. But you get a sense of how big an effect this is. This is why Professor Miller said to me, we are living in a perfect storm of cognitive degradation as a result of being constantly interrupted.
That could inspire some creative HR policies. We also learn in the book that sleep plays a crucial role in our attention capacity. Like, what are the effects of our 24/7 society on our brain?
This blew my mind. So we sleep about 20% less than people did a century ago. The average British child sleeps 85 minutes less than they did in 1945. 85, yeah. An extraordinary reduction. And I went to interview one of the leading experts on this, amazing man named Dr. Charles Czeisler at Harvard Medical School. He's one of the leading sleep experts in the world. He's trained everyone from the US Secret Service to the Boston Red Sox in sleep science. And he said to me, even if nothing else had changed, nothing at all, except that we sleep so much less, that alone would be causing a huge crisis in attention. If you stay awake for 19 hours, which doesn't sound like very much to me, your attention degrades as much as if you'd got legally drunk, right? And there's lots of reasons why, but one reason why is the whole time you're awake, your brain is generating something called metabolic waste. One scientist calls it brain cell poop, which helped me to think about it. So you're awake, it's building up in your brain. And when you go to sleep, when you get into deep sleep, a watery fluid washes through your brain, carries this brain cell poop out of your brain, down into your kidneys and eventually out of your body. If you don't get enough sleep, if you don't get 8 hours sleep a night, your brain literally doesn't clean itself properly. So when you wake up, you're not feeling when you're tired and you feel clogged up. That is not a metaphor. You are literally, your brain is clogged up, right? So we're all going around with brains clogged with this metabolic waste, which builds up over time. It has catastrophic effects in the long term. It's why if you sleep less, you're significantly more likely to get dementia later in life. But it also has immediate effects. If you look at the evidence on, you just give people very simple attention tests. If they haven't slept properly, you perform much worse. And in our societies now, we are all sleeping, or most of us are sleeping, significantly less than humans did in the past. There's a really interesting bit of science that he discovered about this that helped me. So there's many things going on here, but one of them is, there's a really fascinating phenomenon. So imagine you went camping. This is my idea of hell. I would never want to go camping, but imagine you went camping. I know French people like this. If you go camping in the countryside, so imagine you haven't set up your tent and it starts to get dark. As it gets dark, you will get a surge of energy, which is great. It means you'll be able to set up it means you'll be able to set up your tent before it's completely dark and you'd be screwed and it'd be really difficult, right? So you can see there's an evolutionary advantage to that. And if you think about the circumstances where we evolved, it makes perfect sense. It starts to get dark, you get a surge of energy so you can get back to your cave, so you can get back to your tribe, right? So we evolved to get a surge of energy as it gets dark. But now in the environment where we live, you'll be lying in your bed, you'll be watching your phone in bed, this glowing light, you'll start to get tired and you switch off your phone, right? Oh, I'm ready to go to sleep now. But the signal your brain gets is, oh, it just got dark. We need to give him a surge of energy to get back to the cave, right? It doesn't know that you're already in your cave, right? So in the environment we're in, where we're exposed to huge amounts of bright light immediately prior to sleep, we're puzzled. You're like, I was tired. Why am I suddenly awake again? Why can't I go to sleep? Then you switch your phone on again. You watch a bit more. You start checking your email. Then you switch it off again. You get another surge. So the environment we're in is very maladaptive for sleep.
And what about food? Like, we are used to make the connections between the food we eat and obesity or cardiovascular disease. It's newer to link what we eat to our ability to concentrate. But there is a big connection.
I was really surprised by this. Of all the factors that I write about in the book, this is one of the 2 or 3 that most surprised me. And I want to just say to everyone listening, like, I say this with no judgment because I was a complete junk food addict for most of my life. In fact, one of the low points in my life was just before Christmas 2009. I went to my local branch of KFC in East London, where I lived for a long time. And I went in, it was lunchtime, and I said my standard order, which is so disgusting I won't repeat it. And the guy behind the counter said, "Oh, Johann, I'm really glad you're here." I was like, oh, okay. And he went off behind where they fry all the chicken and everything. And he came back with a massive Christmas card in which they'd written, "To our best customer." And one of the reasons my heart sank is I thought, this isn't even the fried chicken shop I come to the most. How could this be happening to me? But so when I interviewed and looked to deep dive into this really fascinating new field called nutritional psychiatry that looks at how the food we eat affects our brain and all sorts of mental functioning. And there's lots of evidence on this. There are several layers to it, but for example, one of the leading nutritionists in Europe, Dale Pinnock, explained to me. So imagine for breakfast, you have the standard, I mean, French people are a bit better than the British people, but imagine you have the standard British or American breakfast. You have, toasted white bread with butter on it, or you have sugary cereal. What that does is it releases a huge amount of energy really quickly into your brain. And it feels great. You're like, wow, I'm awake, I'm ready for the day. It releases a lot of glucose. But it releases so much glucose so quickly that you'll get to your desk, or your kid will get to their school desk a couple of hours later, and you'll have a huge energy crash. And when you have a glucose crash in your brain, you get what's called brain fog, where you just can't focus very well until you have another sugary, carby snack, and then it goes up again, and then it crashes again. The way Dale Pinnock put it to me is the way we eat puts us on a kind of roller coaster of energy spikes and energy crashes, energy spikes and energy crashes throughout the day, which leaves us with these long patches of brain fog. Now imagine instead if you have for breakfast porridge with blueberries in it, right? That releases energy very steadily. You don't get these huge spikes and crashes. So one factor in the food we eat is this energy effect and brain fog effect. Another element is that our diets, the Western diet is now chronically lacking for many people in factors that are essential for your brain to fully function. Fresh fish, for example, really important omega-3s for your brain to function properly. And we have diets that are really lacking in that. And supplements, unfortunately, don't make it up, don't reduce that effect significantly, because your brain doesn't metabolize supplements the way it does from whole foods. The third factor is one that I find really shocking. So it's not just that our diets contain... it's not just that our diets lack stuff we need. Our diets often contain chemicals that act on our brains like drugs. There's a really shocking study in Britain in the city of Southampton. They got 192 kids and they split them into two groups. And the first group was just given water to drink, and the second group was given water laced with loads of like common additives that are found in the food we eat all the time. And then the kids were monitored. The kids that were given the additives were significantly more likely to be manic and struggle focusing, right? So you begin to see how many of these factors are undermining our focus, and how changing your diet can massively boost attention.
Which solutions can we implement? So you mentioned your new routine of walking around in the city without the phone, with just a notebook to let your mind wander. I understand that I can also prioritize my sleep to protect my focus. I can understand that I have to switch my French breakfast and let go of the croissant.
It's tragedy. I think if I come to France and tell them to give up croissant, this will not be a popular book. So yeah, I'll do my best.
Do your best. But yeah, which individual solutions do you recommend?
So for each of the 12 factors that are harming our attention that I write about in Stolen Focus, there are two levels at which we need to respond to them. I think of them as defense and offense. There are loads of changes we can make in our own lives to protect ourselves and our children's attention. And I go through, loads and loads in the book. I'll just give you an example of one, or I'll give you an example of two things people can do literally now.
Yeah.
I would recommend everyone go online and order something called a K-Safe. It's just the letter K followed by safe. I should have bought shares in this company before my book came out, because they're worth much more now. But it's very simple. It's a plastic safe. You take off the lid, you put in your phone, you put on the lid, you turn the dial, and it locks your phone away for anything between 5 minutes and a whole day, however long you tell it to. And once it's locked, you can't get your phone, right? I mean, if there was an emergency, you could smash it, but then you'd have to buy another K-Safe, right? I use that 3 hours a day to do my writing. I would not have finished my most recent book if I didn't use it. Whenever my friends come around for dinner, I always say, we're going to all put our phones in the phone jail. And it's really hard at first, but I always explain to people the pleasure of knowing that I'm actually listening to you and you're actually listening to me will be so much greater than whatever shitty Instagram update you're going to have to wait a couple of hours for, right? And sometimes people say, but what if there's an emergency? I always say to people, but I'm 45, I always say to them, so you remember the first 23 years of our lives, right? The first half of our lives, when you left home, like if there was an emergency, you had to wait until you got home to learn about it. We didn't all die, right? It's okay. You're not the president. You don't have to give orders. It's all right, right? You know, the world can wait for you. So I'd recommend get a case safe. I'd recommend everyone go online now and download an app called Freedom. So let's say you were particularly addicted to Instagram or eBay or Pornhub, whatever your weakness is. You download this app. You can synchronize it between your laptop and your phone and your desktop if you want. And you can say to it, don't let me go on eBay or whatever it is for the next hour, the next day, however long you want. And once you push the button, if you go onto that website, it will just say you have been set free. And there's a little kind of image of a green, I think it's a butterfly, right? I have social media permanently blocked on my phone because I don't want people at my funeral to stand up and say, Johann spent a lot of time on TikTok, right? That's not how I want my life to go. And the truth is, your habits are your life. There's no point in you saying, I'm the kind of person who reads long novels and has good conversations with my friends. If the reality of your life is hour by hour, you're scrolling through, stupid videos of people falling over, right? If hour by hour you spend your life doing that, that's who you are. That's your life. That will become your life, right? And over time, your mind will come to be shaped like that. Take care what technologies you use, because over time, your mind and your thought patterns will come to be shaped like those technologies. So for me, I would recommend doing lots of things like that. I could go through many more in the book.
That's defense.
That's defense. But I want to be really honest with people, because I don't feel most people who are communicating about attention with the public are leveling with people. I am passionately in favor of these individual changes. I've done them myself. A lot of them, not all. They've helped me a lot. But I want to be really candid. There's a limit to how much these things can help you. Because the truth is, this crisis did not happen because you had bad habits or I had bad habits or our kids had bad habits. This crisis happened because of some really big and powerful social forces. And at some point, as has begun in many parts of the world that I went to, we're going to have to take on those forces. We're going to have to challenge those forces. A huge component of this has to be collective, because there are things that we can't do as isolated individuals, right? At times, I think that, purely individual responses are like, Paris is pretty polluted, although it's much better now because of the actions of your mayor, which I really support, around traffic and so on. But, you can react to air pollution by wearing a gas mask, right? If I lived in Beijing, I'd wear a gas mask. But it was much better to deal with air pollution by massively restricting where cars can go, right? And in the same way, at the moment, we think about this purely in terms of gas mask solutions, which have some significant value, but we've got to take on those forces. And I went to places that have begun to do it.
So that's more like a political answer. But between this political answer and the individual solutions, are there other collective levels where we can act within my friends, within my families, within my co-workers? What can I do to protect my attention and our attention?
Well, let's pick on the last one you chose, co-workers. It's really interesting. So we've ended up with a kind of bizarre and profoundly wrong conception of productivity. So we think the productive worker is the worker who answers the boss's email immediately, who soaks up all the stress you put on them without ever pushing back, who, is still awake at midnight to answer the email. In fact, the science is very clear. These are all things that destroy productivity, right? Being sleep deprived, being constantly interrupted, being overly stressed. These factors destroy productivity, right? And especially now in this AI environment, what will be a productive worker in this new environment? Look, AI is going to do the simple, immediate tasks much better than we can pretty soon. In fact, it already can in many cases. That's not what we need. What we need to be as workers, and what employers need from their workers, is deep thought, creativity, the things that AI is not good at, right? So we've ended up in this bizarre productivity trap where, a brilliant guy called Professor Jeffrey Pfeffer, who's one of the leading experts on organizational management in the world, I interviewed him at Stanford in California, said to me, everyone knows this at some level about their sports team. We had the Euros last year. No French person wanted the French team to walk onto the pitch, exhausted having not slept the night before, stressed out of their mind, and with their phone to check during the game, right? Anyone who suggested such a technique would have been laughed out of court, right? He said to me, okay, if that's true of your football team, that's true of your colleagues, that's true of you, right? So we need to radically reappraise what we think productivity is. We need to challenge that at every level. Think about something as simple as how we've redesigned offices or how we've redesigned schools, right? So we had a huge move towards open plan offices. The science on this could not be clearer. We have two kinds of attention. There's top-down attention and bottom-up attention. Sounds fancy, but it's pretty simple. Top-down attention is when you're focusing on it. We're both engaged in top-down attention now, right? We could be looking at, like I was saying before, we could be looking around the room. We could be looking at, you've got my book in front of you, you could be looking at that. But you're using your executive function, your powers of attention to filter that out, and you're using your willpower to narrow it down to listening to what I'm saying, right? That's top-down attention. But there's also something called bottom-up attention. Bottom-up attention is involuntary. If a bomb went off on the street outside, you would stop listening to me and I would stop listening to you, and we would turn and we would look in the direction of the explosion, right? That's bottom-up. It's involuntary. And we're constantly in a conflict, not constantly, but often in a conflict between top-down and bottom-up attention. In an open plan office, where you hear the person next to you, you hear your other colleagues, you're constantly having to use your willpower to block out that noise, and your top-down attention is limited, right? Willpower is a finite resource. So we've created environments where we're constantly having to work really hard, even with noise-cancelling headphones and all the other things we have, to block out that constant interruption, right? That's just one of many factors. So you think about, we need to be aware of these factors and we need to redesign our environment to move away from open plan offices. But there's dozens of other things. For example, I spent a load of time with a company called Perpetual Guardian in New Zealand, where they've made all sorts of changes. But one of them was a really simple one. Everyone who works for that company has a mug on their desk. And if they're open to conversation and people coming along and interrupting them, then they leave the mug empty. And if they're in deep focus and they don't want to be interrupted, they put a flag in the mug. And they're like, don't go and talk to Bob right now because he's focusing, right? Very simple, but significantly improved their productivity. So there's loads of things I go through in the book that we can do, you're right, at that sort of level that's in between the isolated individual and the society as organizations and groups. We can redesign our schools. I have to say, France has had in my view, disastrous move when it comes to schooling, as has Britain and the US. So there's loads of evidence that the fancy way to put it is that attention evolved to attach to meaning. Sounds very complicated, but it's very simple. The more meaningful something is to you, the more easy it is to pay attention. Right? You know this perfectly well. If you gave me a book about French politics, I would find that really easy to read because I'm really interested in French politics. If you gave me a book about, I don't know, Formula One racing, which I don't give a shit about, I would find that really difficult to read because it's not meaningful to me, right? A frog will stare longer at a fly than it will at a stone because the fly is meaningful to the frog and the stone is not. So the more something is meaningful, the easier it is to pay attention to. But we redesigned our school systems around getting our kids to memorize meaningless shit for tests that measure nothing of any value, right? That's what our schooling systems largely are. if you wanted to design a school system that would ruin kids' attention, that is the school system you would design, right? It's why when I went to schools that were much more progressive, which are all about the kids discovering the meaning of what they're doing and pursuing the meaning they care about, their attention is dramatically better. So there's all sorts of things we can do at the level of the school, at the level of the office, and at the level of our families that I go through, which are that sort of intermediate level. And then there's, of course, things we need to do as societies.
What about meditation and mindfulness? As you mentioned those practices in the book. Can they help us protect our attention?
They can, and I'm in favour of meditation. I think you can sense a hesitation in my voice because I meditate, it helps me, but I'm very wary of the fact that we've gotten into this situation where the first recourse that people are offered is meditation. It makes me think a lot about, there was a great historian of France called Laurent Berlant, an American historian of France, who invented a phrase called cruel optimism. Cruel optimism is where you take something with really big social causes, obesity, depression, attention problems, and you say to people, great news, I've got a solution for you. Just meditate for 10 minutes a day and it'll solve all these problems, right? And the reason it's called cruel optimism is because it appears to be optimism. It's like, hey, I got the solution, but it's actually cruel because you're setting the person up to fail because the solution is not commensurate to the size of the problem, right? He gives an example, it's not him, someone called Ronald Purser, a brilliant professor in California, gives a really good example of cruel optimism. There was a company that threw their workers off of their health insurance and then gave them free mindfulness courses, right? And to me, that's like a perfect metaphor for a lot of what we're doing, right? It's like, the way I think of it is you think about these companies like Facebook, TikTok, and so on. It's like they're constantly pouring itching powder on us. You know, this powder that used to be a toy that kids had or a prank that kids had. They're pouring this itching powder over us and then they're leaning forward and going, hey, buddy, you should learn how to meditate. Then you wouldn't scratch all the time. And you want to go, fuck you, I'll learn to meditate. That has great value, but you need to stop pouring this fucking itching powder over me, right? So we need to... I'm wary of purely individualistic solutions, valuable though they are, and meditation of course is, because attention is like a muscle and meditation is a way of building up that muscle, so it is of course valuable. But yeah, we need to look at, and this is why it was so revealing to me, spending so much time in Silicon Valley. So I interviewed people who designed key aspects of the world in which we now live. And the thing that most struck me about them is how sick with guilt they feel about what they've done. You know, I mentioned Dr. Williams before, so he'd worked at the heart of Google. And one day, he was at a tech conference where the audience were literally the people who, if anyone listening has kids, the people who designed the stuff your kids are using today. And he said to them, if there's anyone here who wants to live in the world that we're creating, please put up your hand. And nobody put up their hand. And he was like, I can't do this anymore. I'm out of here. And he quit. And they kept explaining to me one of the key dynamics here, which weirdly took me quite a long time to understand because I thought it sounded too simplistic. It sounded too almost conspiratorial. So they explained to me, if you open now TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, any of the mainstream social media apps, and you begin to scroll, those companies begin to make money out of you in two ways. The first way is really obvious. You see advertising. Okay, no one needs me to explain that. The second way is much more important. Everything you ever do on these apps is scanned and sorted by their artificial intelligence algorithms to figure out who you are and what makes you tick. What makes you happy, what makes you angry, what makes you horny, what makes you sad, right? And it's harvesting this information, it's learning this information for many reasons, but the most crucial one is to figure out what to show you next to keep you scrolling. For a very simple reason. Every time you open the app and begin to scroll, they begin to make money because you see ads. The longer you scroll, the more money they make because the more ads you see. Same for your kids. Every time your kid opens, they begin to make money. The longer your kid scrolls, the more money they make. So all of this genius in Silicon Valley, when it's applied to social media, or this AI, or these algorithms, is geared towards one thing and one thing only. Figuring out how do we get you to open the app as often as possible and scroll as long as possible. That's it. Just like the head of KFC might be a perfectly nice woman, but all she cares about in her professional capacity is how big was how often did you go to KFC this week and how big was the bucket you bought. All these companies care about is how often did you open the app and how long did you scroll. The way my friend Tristan Harris, who also worked at the Heart of the Machine, put it to me is, these apps are machines designed to frack your attention. So you can try having self-control, but every time you do, there are 10,000 engineers on the other side of the screen working very hard to undermine your self-control.
To conclude with a message of hope, Johann, like Tristan Harris, we can all start the attention rebellion. What might that look like in concrete terms? So for all the people who are listening to the podcast, can we give them a direction to start the attention rebellion?
Yeah, there's loads of things we need to do, but I'll give you an example from the history of France that should inspire all of us. So you're younger than me, but when I was a child, and anyone over the age of 35 listening will remember this, when I was a child, the only form of gasoline you could buy in this country, my dad's from Switzerland, so I spent a lot of time in Switzerland and France when I was a kid. The only form of gasoline you could get in this country, in Britain, in fact, everywhere in the world, was leaded gasoline, leaded petrol. And it was discovered that exposure to lead was really bad for people's brains and particularly bad for children's ability to focus and pay attention. And obviously, if it was in the petrol, it was in the fumes, it was in the air, everyone in France was breathing in historically unprecedented amounts of lead. And it was really harming kids' brains. So what happened was a group of ordinary mothers, what were called housewives at the time, banded together and they said, well, why are we allowing this? Why are we allowing these for-profit companies, the lead industry, to fuck up our kids' brains, right? And it's really important to notice what those mothers didn't say. They didn't say, so let's ban cars, let's all go back to the horse and cart, right? Let's all join the Amish. That's not what they said. What they said is, just like none of us are saying, let's ban technology and, go back to the 1970s, that's not the answer. What they said is, let's get rid of the specific component in petrol that's harming our kids' brains and replace it with a different kind of petrol that doesn't screw up our kids' brains. And these mothers, this is forgotten now, but they fought like hell for their children, right? Mm. And they were really resisted. And it followed the classic pattern of all political movements, successful movements that was described by Mahatma Gandhi. First they ignored them, then they laughed at them, then they fought them, then they won. As everyone listening knows, there's no more leaded petrol. As a result, the average French child is 5 IQ points higher than they would have been had those mothers not fought for all of us. Mm. Now, to me, that's a really important model. In addition to all the individual stuff and all the stuff we need to do in our schools and our offices, that's a really important example, should inspire us for what we need to do. There's many things we need to do. We need to regulate the food industry. We need to regulate social media. Now, there's many things we need to do for that. I was just in Australia last week. They just banned all social media for under 16-year-olds in one of their states. It's going to roll out across the country almost certainly. I was speaking to some of the key decision makers there. That's one thing. We need to change the business model for social media. We can do that through regulation. I explain how in the book. If we do that, it breaks the incentive for them to screw with our attention. There's all sorts of things we can do, but it requires a real shift in psychology. Like I said before, we need to stop blaming ourselves. It didn't happen because you fucked up and I fucked up. It happened because the environment became fucked up, right? So we need to stop blaming ourselves and start blaming the people who did this to us. And we need to realize, we are not medieval peasants begging at the table of King Musk and King Zuckerberg for a few little crumbs of attention from their table like they're Louis XIV, right? We are the free citizens of democracies, extremely hard-won democracies in the case of France, and we own our own minds. And together, we can take them back if we want to.
and win the rebellion. Thank you so
Woo.
much, Johann Hari, for joining us today on Metamorphose.
Thank you so much for how much, it sounds like an ironic thing to say, but thank you for how much attention you paid to the book and everything you've done to champion it. I'm really grateful to you. And I really want people to understand that this is not an effect of the modern world. This is something that is being done to you, and you can reclaim your mind.
It was a deep pleasure to have you, and everyone who's listening can find your book, Stolen Focus, in international bookstores, published in France under the name On vous vole, votre attention, with the Éditions Eyrolles. And you can subscribe to Metamorphose newsletter to stay updated on our upcoming episodes. Thank you.
Hooray, thank you.
Check out the special guest of the week on Instagram at Metamorphosepodcast. If you like this podcast, promote it by giving it 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to follow all the episodes for free.
Metamorphose. Awaken your consciousness.